Okay, it being 6:30, I'll call to order the meeting of the Oregon School District Board of Education. Today is February 12, 2018. We're at the Oregon School District Innovation Center at the Oregon High School. Ms. Wick, would you call the roll?
Ms. Feeney? Present. Ms. Odorico? Here. Ms. Flanagan? Here. Mr. Raymond? Here. Mr. Kraus?
Yo.
Mr. LeBrun?
Here.
Mr. Zach?
Present. Board has a quorum. I have proof that the meeting has been appropriately noticed under Wisconsin Open Meetings Law, and the certification of those postings will be with Ms. Wick if anyone wants to inspect them. Our agenda tonight includes, in addition to our typical items, action items from policy. We have 3 policies to consider and review. The primary item for tonight is discussion on the Student Growth and Population Task Force report. A report on the state information item, report on the state budget for 17-19. At the conclusion of our public session, the board will go into closed session for 2 items, and the board is not anticipated to returning to open session at the conclusion of those closed session discussions. With that, I'd seek approval of the agenda as posted. Mr. Raymond with the motion, is there a second? Mr. LeBrun with a second. Is there any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? We have an agenda for proceeding this evening. Item A under the agenda is a consent calendar. Is there any item that any board member wishes to remove from the consent calendar? Seeing none, I need a motion to approve the items on the consent calendar.
So moved.
Ms. Flanagan with the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Kraus with the second. All those in favor, there's no contract or policy, so we can do this by voice vote. All those in favor of the items on the consent calendar signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Those items are approved by unanimous voice vote.
Okay.
Item B of the agenda is communication from the public. The board has established pursuant to Policy 18004 an opportunity for residents of the district to address the board. Ms. Wick, has any member of the public registered with you to speak this evening?
No.
Is there any member of the public that wishes to speak this evening? Seeing none, we'll move on to C, OEA report. And is there anybody from the OEA willing to report tonight? We're clean, Nathan? Okay. Student report. Hi, Ellen. Anything great to report on tonight? I know you and I are still trying to arrange a meeting. Some morning we both had crazy weeks, so I will get together with you by email to set that time and talk about things to report on, but I know you're interested in hearing the report on the student task force or growth task force. Okay. That takes us to action items number D from policy. We've got 3 policies, and I'll turn the floor over to Ms. Flanagan, the chair of policy committee. The floor is yours, Krista.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 things that came from policy for the board to review and approve. The first being a new policy 616, which is naming of facilities and land. People had this information in the packet, and you'll notice the one that was just handed out has a few changes we had from the policy meeting right before. This is really concerning the formal naming of facilities owned or otherwise controlled by the school district. And if you move down to 616.02, we talk about purpose, and then 616.3 is what we consider facilities in terms of what would come before the board for a naming. And then 616.4 is the criteria we would use. And then if we were to name something, it would be a 2/3 vote of the full board. And then if we would need to rename or removal of that name. So I'll answer any questions if people have any concerning that new policy.
Anyone have any questions for Krista?
Not so much a question, but 616.6, it doesn't call out the 2/3 board vote. I don't know if you want to, make that explicit or not.
I think what we did there was if you're renaming, you're actually removing then the name, or you're getting a new name, and so we had those be covered under 0.5 and 0.7, but if people feel like you want to have that called out on 6, we could do that.
I have a question of procedure regarding that. Does it take more than a 2/3 vote to approve this policy?
No.
I'm getting a nod from Janie that it does.
No, the naming is by 2/3. Approving the policy is simple majority.
So if you wanted to approve a name by a simple majority, you could just change the policy and then change the name without using 2/3. So I don't know why having something that's passable by a simple majority can tell us that we need 2/3 here. It just doesn't make sense to me.
I suppose boards, you can do that, but
That's, I guess, Robert's Rules of Order in terms of adopting a policy,
Yeah.
and then you're setting how you vote on the policy within the policy. So,
yeah. Any other questions? I've got a couple just editorial. I've got one question. Well, I'll do the question first. What's in 616.4C? We talk about doing this for 20 years. That's a long time. And what's the rationale behind that?
Sure. So when I practiced law in Chicago, it was just an industry practice that we recommended to clients so that there weren't surprises if you named something after a living person or someone who hadn't been deceased for very long. So we talked about that at policy. If the board wanted to do something else, I'm not wed to it, just a recommendation so that you're not renaming after someone made choices that were different than when you had named something after that person that maybe weren't in accordance with the district mission and values. So we did talk about like the Penn State example.
I think 20 is too long. I would go with 10, but I guess we're all just throwing darts at the wall when you pick a number. I can see if there's someone, you know, who's been iconic in the district that we would have to wait for 20 years to name something after them.
Well, and the other factor is the policy says may consider, so it's not a shall. The board is not bound to it if it wanted to consider something else.
Sure, that helps me a lot with that. Thanks. In terms of just an editing thing in 616.2 in the first sentence, I would put at the end of that, when approving names for district facilities. And then in 616.3, I would put facility includes any district building, land, park, or athletic field, stadium. And then take that last sentence out. Makes it shorter. And then in 616.4A, I would capitalize district. That's all I had for suggested changes.
we can take those. I think in 616.4A, when you talk about district being an area, it's lowercase, is my understanding. That's why we have that lowercase. If it's you're actually talking about the specific Oregon school district, then capital D is capitalized.
Sure, okay.
Going back through 616.3, I don't know if you had the updated version that said facilities include buildings, parts of buildings, lands, parks, bridges, athletic facilities. What was your edit there?
I would take that last sentence out and just use one sentence for whatever it is and say facility includes any district building, and then not plural, not have those plural but singular. That way we just it refers to both those that are in existence at the time when the naming takes place. And then I would
think
add
the reason we had the second sentence is if we pre-name something. And so you're saying to take out that sentence, this includes existing facilities as well as facilities do not yet exist?
I think it would apply anyway because we're naming it.
I don't know if anybody else on policy has thought on that. It doesn't really matter to me.
Okay. And then in 616.2 it would be just adding at the end for district facilities.
Yeah.
Okay. Krista will need a motion on behalf of the policy committee.
On behalf of the policy committee, I move that the board approve new policy 616, naming of facilities and land.
Okay, and would
with Steve's editing.
into 616.2 and 616.3. Okay, so we have a motion from the policy committee that does not need a second.
One comment.
Yeah.
Sorry. I would agree that 20 years is a long time, and I like the idea of 10 years. And although I see that it says may, I think it's the ideal situation is that this policy is really followed. I think it's a really great idea, and I thank the policy committee for doing this. And I think changing it to 10 years is safe enough to make sure we're not dealing with something that emerged that is of concern, and will improve the probability that the policy will be followed.
Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts on 10 years versus 20 years?
I do have some concerns about 10 years. I think things that are currently in the news, or you look at the Penn State example, I think 10 years is, I think we went with 20 years for that purpose. So I don't agree with that.
Anybody else? Dan?
I would support a 10-year time period.
Okay, we've got a motion from policy that includes some changes to 616.2 and 616.3. If anybody wants to make an amendment with respect to 10 or 20 years, we'd have to have that motion made to amend on the table. Then else we'll proceed to have a vote on the policy that's before us.
I'll make
Steve?
a motion.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
After
Okay,
you,
I'll make a motion that we.
You're going to move to, it would be a motion to amend the motion on the table,
Correct.
and it would be to change the 20 years to 10 years?
Yes.
Okay, and Dan seconds that. Any discussion on that issue? Okay, so we'll take a roll call on that. The motion is to amend the policy that's on the table to change 20 years to 10 years in 616.4C. Any discussion on that? The motion is to amend the current policy that's on the table for consideration to change the 20 years to 10 years. And it's not to approve the policy as a whole, but just to change what's on the table. Okay, Ms. Wick, would you call the roll? And it's to change it from 20 to 10, so a yes vote is to make that change.
So, Mr. Kraus?
yes.
Ms. Feeney?
Yes.
Ms. Oderico?
No.
Ms. Flanagan?
No.
Mr. Raymond?
Yes.
Mr. LeBrun?
No.
Mr. Zott?
No. Motion to amend fails. So then we have the motion to approve the policy as brought forth by the policy committee. Would you call any further discussion on that? Okay, Ms. Wick, would you call the roll?
Ms. Flanagan?
Yes.
Mr. Raymond? Mr. Kraus?
Yes.
Mr. LeBrun?
Yes.
Ms. Feeney?
Yes.
Ms. Oderico? Yes. Mr. Zott?
Yes. Policy is adopted, 616. Thanks, policy committee. Thanks for the opportunity for me to exercise some parliamentary procedure. I was getting rusty there. We haven't done that in a while. All right, Krista, you've got the floor still.
Okay, back to this is amending an existing policy, which is 436, which is student policy on alcohol and other drugs. I will take this one first. It's just the addition of addressing vaping. So we've added some language to address that mirrors the paragraph before it, but just talks about use or possession of tobacco products containing nicotine or electronic cigarettes or similar devices that are meant to produce a vapor regardless of nicotine level.
You make that motion on behalf of policy?
I do.
Okay, so that's coming from policy, does not need a second. All right. Everybody have the current version of that? Yeah, we're on 436.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll give Jeff a second to take a look. Everybody else have a copy? Jeff, let me know when you're ready. You got it? You're good? Okay. Any questions from any board member or of Krista or policy committee? I have one, and that's the phrase including communication via electronic media. Help me with that.
We did have some discussion on that, and I'm going to turn that over to Gina so she can walk you through that.
Okay, so we did have quite a few discussions. I was hoping you would know as our historian. We looked at 436-0101, and it's in there. So wanted to mirror that language. And so what we talked about is that if, for example, someone was vaping in the bleachers and took a picture of that on social media, that would be enforceable in the same way that if they were on the bleachers actually vaping at the time.
Go ahead, Dan.
One thing that I think we had discussed, and we did discuss this for quite a bit, was that it would also include if someone was studying from home, engaging with other students and a teacher on a study from home type of a thing, and they were vaping or smoking during their video chat with the other students, even though they would be at home. We believe that the language in this policy would cover that as punishable under this policy.
Yep, and that refreshes my recollection as to why it was in 436-0101. That was precisely the reason we adopted that. Okay, thanks. That answers my question on that. Any other questions? Okay, we have a motion from Policy Committee on the floor to approve the changes as before us of 436. Yep. Jeff.
I just noticed that the section in red is also labeled 0101. Is that an addition to the existing 0101?
Nope, I just need to fix the numbers.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
So with the assumption that the numbering gets fixed by Janie, then you got that. Okay. Would you call the roll?
Ms. Flanagan?
Yes.
Mr. Raymond?
Yes.
Mr. Kraus?
Yes.
Mr. Lebrun?
Yes.
Ms. Feeney?
Yes.
Ms. Odorico? Mr. Zock?
Yes, that motion carries, and the policy is approved. One more, Krista. 716.
There we go. Okay, 716, non-smoking, changing the title to add electronic cigarettes. And so again, this is just adding some language. You can see in red what is new to this, and I guess the difference from what you saw before was that it's a referral to law enforcement change from prosecution under municipal and state statutes, that as a school district we refer to law enforcement.
Any question? Are you going to move that on behalf of policy?
So moved.
Yep. Doesn't need a second. Any questions? Comments? Seeing none, Janie, would you call the roll?
Ms. Flanagan?
Yes.
Mr. Raymond? Yes. Mr. Kraus?
Yes.
Mr. Lebrun?
Yes.
Ms. Feeney?
Yes.
Ms. Odorico? Yes. Mr. Zock?
Yes. Changes to policy 716 are approved by unanimous vote. Thanks, Krista. Who says policy committee isn't fun, right? Okay. Thank you. That ends our agenda items under D, action items. We will now go to discussion action item E. That's one, student growth and population task force, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Jeff Raymond.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Steve. On January 31st, the Vision Steering Committee was visited by the Student Growth and Population Task Force, and they presented their final report to the committee, and it was very well received, and it was officially received and accepted by the Vision Steering Committee. At that time, we thought it would be a good idea if the task force presented to the full board at a regular board meeting, because we have cameras running and folks from the public can more easily see what's going on, since we don't usually get too many members of the public at VSC meetings. So, is that a complaint? So with that, I'll turn the floor over to one of the co-chairs of the task force, Leslie.
Thanks, and Leslie, could you kind of introduce who we have here, and then the floor is yours to proceed.
Thank you. I'll start by introducing the members of the task force who are present. So Courtney Odorico and I were the facilitators of the task force, and we were fortunate enough to have some wonderful people join us. So we have over here Julie Isley and Carlene Beechin and Jim Hagstrom and Carrie Majeski. And those on the committee but not able to join us tonight are Bob Eveland and Tracy Leiter and Phil Van Kampen. So, and thankfully, Andy joined us for most of the meetings too, because he was a really important addition. However, our work as a task force would be not nearly what it is, what you will see tonight, without the work of our really amazing partners in this process, and that would be Mark Roffers from MD Consulting and Matt Wolfert from Bray Architects, and also Nathan Sheevy was a huge help and played a large role, because the task force gave us, the Vision Steering Committee gave us 2 jobs. 3 really, but the first was to look at student census projections, and then to look at the current capacity of our buildings, and then to make recommendations based off what we found in examining the first 2 items. So Mark's work was completely invaluable in the student census component, and the work from Bray Architects was helped us to understand the capacity of our current facilities. So now, in order to give the full board, in addition to people who may be watching at home, a really clear picture of the last year's worth of work by the task force, Mark Roffers will lead you through a presentation that includes our process and our product, which is a short list of recommendations based on everything that we learned this past year. Courtney, anything else? Okay.
Great. And before we launch into that, Mark, 2 things. One is Troy. I've asked Troy if he'd be comfortable sitting at the table with us. Troy's running for school board and is unopposed and has been attending these meetings, and I thought it'd be valuable if Troy participated and had the opportunity to ask any questions. So thanks, Troy. Secondly, we're going to get a presentation of the report from Mark and the task force. Board members or anybody here, if you have any questions about a specific item that's being referred on that needs clarification, feel free to jump in at this point. It's meant to be a discussion as we go along. Once the presentation is concluded, I would ask that the board receive the report if it's so inclined, and then we will have the opportunity to ask the task force questions of any additional questions that we might have, or ask for any information we might need as a board as we move forward, and then I want to have some conversation amongst the board as to process forward. So anybody have any questions from the board before we proceed with getting the report? Okay, Mark, the floor is yours, or Leslie, whoever's going to kick us off. Thanks. We'll get it set so that we want to make sure that this is broadcast.
Just a second. You should be good. Very good. Well, thank you. Give me a chance for a better introduction. I am Mark Roffers. I'm happy to be here tonight. It's an exciting time for the district. Looking back over the last year, the task force has done a lot of work. I think fulfilled your charge and then some in terms of delivering a set of products to you. I'm here tonight to be, I guess, the figurehead in presenting the information that was developed over that period of time, and as was suggested, very ready to answer questions in addition to the other folks here at the table. So what I'll do here with this presentation is okay.
Andy, can you check the screens?
The screens. I lost, yeah, some connection somewhere. I see it on mine, but There we go. So what I'd like to talk to you about tonight, just to give you a sneak preview, is the purpose of the task force study. Our first phase, which involved comparing enrollment projections versus the capacities of existing schools. And then conclude by talking about the task force second phase of its work, which involved the development of values, goals, and parameters, an evaluation of the expansion capacity or capability of existing schools, and then the culmination of the work, a set of alternative facility paths or different directions the district could take in fulfilling its facility needs over the next 10 to 15 years. First, talk a little bit about our purpose. The charge of the task force, Leslie did a good job summarizing it. I don't need to spend a lot of time here. I will point out that you're dealing with a school district with multiple points of growth. It's not all Village of Oregon. Obviously, Village of Brooklyn has been growing over the years. And increasingly, the City of Fitchburg portion of the district is experiencing growth, and that we expect to continue. So the task force looked at all of that, looked at whether additional facilities are needed, and if so, what different grades the facilities might be needed for over our projection period. So in phase one of the project, our team developed projections. We focused our enrollment projections on reviewing planned residential development and demographic change in the district and translating that into student enrollment change. Our projections for enrollment were broken down into 3 time periods, between now and 2020, up to 2025, and then to our projection year of 2030. We projected both housing and enrollment within that time period and broke it down by 63 different neighborhoods, subdividing the district into smaller components. That allowed us to do, and will allow you to do, a lot of interesting things with those projections over time. And then working with our friends at Bray, compared those projections with the capacities of the existing schools in your district. And that's detailed in 2 larger reports that are certainly available for review. The second phase of the process involved the so what questions. We have the projections, we know the capacities of schools. What next? The task force developed a series of goals to help form different options for addressing capacity needs, and later to evaluate those options against a set of criteria. The task force directed the evaluation of existing school sites and facilities, namely which facilities could accommodate, or should it be viewed as accommodating potential expansion. And that involved touring all the facilities and some several discussions. The second phase of the process involved developing a broad range of options for addressing facility needs. I think we were at 12 initially, dropped down to 9. We added a few more later on. So I figure there's probably about 15 different options that were considered over the task force's work. Those were then evaluated and then included in the report that many of you have in front of you tonight. What the task force didn't do and hasn't done is recommend any particular path of the 4+ that you have before you. It did do an extensive evaluation, pros and cons of each path. I'll go into some of that tonight. It also didn't identify specific sites for future schools that are identified in any of the paths, although it did express some preferences, but broadly speaking, for where to site schools. And that phase 2, as I suggested already, is in that report that is in front of the board tonight. So the summary of our enrollment projections, we actually finished this work a few months ago. Several of the board saw it probably more than once, but especially for those who haven't, I have a piece of the presentation here that relates to that. We started again with our projections by looking at housing growth and then translating that into enrollment growth by these 63 different neighborhoods. And then broadly speaking, we view the district as being an increasingly popular location for growth of new housing, in particular at the northern edge of your district. The City of Fitchburg portion of the of the school district, and on the west side of the Village of Oregon, where you have been experiencing a fair amount of housing growth over the last several years. That development, we found, is very appealing for families, people with kids or people about to have children. In fact, working with district staff, we did a survey of folks that had pulled building permits in the Village of Oregon and City of Fitchburg, and in particular, the amount of Oregon School District kids per unit in the Village of Oregon are very high, and among the highest I've seen in any of the work I've done for the various districts in the county and state. What do we see as we looked at the housing unit growth? Well, we projected an increase from about 8,800 housing units today to about 15,200 housing units by the year 2030. So it's not quite a doubling of the number of housing units, but it's close. That includes housing units of all types. It includes single-family homes, certainly, but also multiple family residences of different types. And as we look at growth throughout your district, and really in the county, there is a growing demand and supply of multiple family housing. And so we certainly see that occurring in your district, and particularly at the northern edge of your district, where the City of Fitchburg policies support that type of development. Where, broadly speaking, do we expect the housing unit growth? Nearly 9 out of 10 new housing units in the northern half of your district, in the area that's now being served by the 2 Oregon elementary schools primarily. We mapped all that growth in our report. This map that's on the screen here today shows broadly where we'd expect the growth to occur. The Village of Oregon is located in the geographic center of your district, and on this map, certainly with the brighter colors you see, there's housing unit growth in different parts of the village we expect over the next 10 to 15 years. Smaller scale development in the Village of Brooklyn, but still some new housing growth happening there. And where you see the brighter colors at the north edge, that's where we project the most new housing units within your district. And that will include both multiple family and single family housing development in a variety of different projects. How does that translate to enrollment growth? It's not a one-to-one comparison, and what we have is different neighborhoods that are already built out, changing over time. Some are we expect to have more kids by 2030. Some that may be crawling with children today may have relatively few in the year 2030 as those kids grow up, but the parents stick around for a while. So our work involved mixing all that together to figure out what the enrollment growth would be for the district. So the enrollment we project, broadly speaking, is from about 3,800 plus K through 12 students in your district today to about 5,700 students by the year 2030. So about 1,900 additional students that we'd expect the district to be educating 12, 13 years from now. The breakdown of that student growth is on the screen. It's really at all levels. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of that increasingly we expect would be generated from the northern edge of your district. The City of Fitchburg portion of your school district, we expect we'll have perhaps 1,000 additional K through 12 students in the next 12 to 13 years to add to the 250 or so that currently come to your schools. So we did the same thing with enrollment projections as we did with housing unit growth on a heat map, tried to show where the greatest enrollment is. A couple of things I've noted on this map. First is you see that a lot of the same areas of housing unit growth are also giving you the most enrollment growth. The second thing I'll point out, particularly as I move forward through these maps, is although we see a lot of enrollment growth in Fitchburg, that's really driven by the number of housing units we expect there in total. As we go to the Oregon and Brooklyn numbers, while we don't have as many housing units projected there, we have more single-family housing units, which tend to generate substantially more kids per unit than do multiple family development. What does that mean compared to the capacity of the existing schools? Bray did an extensive analysis of capacity of each existing school, providing a range. That range was based on the the class size ranges that you have for each grade. And so this particular graph shows in the K through 4 elementary schools the orange line representing the projected enrollment growth in K through 4 enrollment, and the green area means that you in theory are under the capacity range of your elementary schools combined. We're currently slightly over that, and I should say within the range, within the yellow zone. The yellow zone represents the in between of the class size guidelines added up among all of the schools, the elementary schools. And then when the orange line exceeds that yellow area, that means that the projected enrollment is above the maximum capacity of the elementary school. So you can see in the elementary school range, we project that enrollment will exceed maximum capacity somewhere around the year 2020 and go up from there. This is assuming no change in elementary school capacity. The intermediate school picture is on this second graphic. Intermediate school is currently approaching the lower level of the capacity range. It may in fact be over it with more recent enrollment numbers. We project that by 2020 the intermediate school will be operating significantly above its current capacity, and that would, without any changes, only grow. The middle school has currently more capacity than Rome Corners intermediate school. Therefore, there's a little more time to address capacity issues at the middle school. We project that the enrollment at the middle school will exceed, or will get into that capacity range, yellow bar, by around the year 2020 and exceed maximum capacity by around 2025. And then finally, given the recent investments in the high school, we anticipate that the high school will be operating under its maximum capacity up until sometime between the year 2025 and 2030, especially given the subdivision of the first floor space that was shelled out as part of the most recent project. So what do the enrollment versus capacity projections mean in summary? Over the next few years, the greatest capacity issues we see will be at the intermediate and the elementary school levels, with Rome Corners being well over capacity by the year 2020, and the elementary schools well over their maximum capacity by the year 2025. Middle school capacity issues lag a little bit behind Rome Corners because the middle school has more capacity today than does Rome Corners. And our high school, your high school, should accommodate projected enrollment until around the year 2030 if the district pursues a second story infill project as was anticipated by the last building project. So that's the issue, and the next phase we'll talk about a little bit about potential solutions.
Good. That's a take a breath moment.
Thank you.
Get you off the podium for a second. I'll note that, Mark, you did a significant report on this, which was received by the task force in September 2017, and it's been vetted and thoroughly questioned by the task force. I know the Vision Steering Committee, Jeff, also had an opportunity to review this report. So what we've seen today, Mark, was just your synopsis of what's in this in terms of the enrollment projections. This document's available at the district office if any community member wants to review that. It'll also be placed online if it's not there already, so community members can see the projections and the work that's gone into getting these summary numbers. I know you did extensive work and actually went back and redoubled your look at it when you saw the numbers initially. So, and then the second report that's out there that came in October 2017 was work done by Bray Architects, and Matt, you were involved in doing this, which is a capacity study of our buildings. Again, that was presented to the task force and vetted, and then through the Vision Steering Committee as well as seen this, correct, Jeff? Okay, and likewise, the capacity study of our district buildings will be available at the district office for any community member, and will also be placed online for their inspection or review. Okay. Where to now? We know we've got, by projections, significant enrollment increase, and we're going to have some capacity pinch. So where do we go?
So at the same time that those reports that President Zach just cited were going on, that the task force was working to develop a set of values, goals, and parameters. Why? It provided the foundation for the development of initial options to deal with the projected growth. It also later on, the values and goals and parameters served as a lens that the task force used to evaluate and compare the different options against one another. And the parameters and goals did evolve over time as the task force continued to discuss options and learn more throughout the process. The final versions of which are in your report. I'll put up way too many words on the next couple of slides. This is a summary of some of the values and goals that the task force eventually used to compare the options most frequently against one another. They involved to highlight a couple, providing flexible facilities that could change grade groupings over time and serve capacity, provide capacity expansions over time, things like that. The task force was concerned about making sure that larger schools in the district, if there were any, were configured in such a way to maintain or retain a small school feel. To maximize the access to schools, making sure that congestion was minimized, making sure to the extent possible schools were placed in regionally sensible locations, and to minimize busing times, particularly for younger kids. And then I think, and you'll see this coming across in the different facility paths, and certainly came across in the task force's discussion, is providing a facility plan that worked in the long term, and that recognize that in 2030 the district is not going to close its doors, but we'll have to make facility decisions beyond that too. The next page suggests parameters. There's a lot of gray area between what was a value, a goal, and a parameter, but a parameter was, in a nutshell, a slightly more measurable basis against which to compare the options. I mentioned earlier the task force did not recommend particular sites, and that's true. One of the parameters, though, was to locate schools in areas of growth. So some of the areas you saw in oranges and yellows and reds on those maps made the most sense, but in also areas with regional accessibility, recognizing that some of those areas that may have a lot of kids today or may have a lot of kids in 10 years, in 20 or 30 years may not have very many at all. So making sure that we're citing schools in the right spots forever, not just to serve a short-term bubble. The district, with Bray's help, also evaluated the expansion capacity of each of the existing schools. So the logical question would be, well, you're going to have more enrollment growth. Why don't we just make all of our existing schools bigger to accommodate that enrollment growth? So each and every school was evaluated for its enrollment capacity, not just the school, but also the site and the neighborhood within which the school is located. Based on that evaluation, the task force did not recommend expanding any of the 3 existing elementary schools. For Netherwood, Knoll, and Prairie View, the fact is that they already accommodate 1,000 students on a relatively small site in an area that's not, at least in the immediate area, projected for significant enrollment growth. Brooklyn, while it has greater site area and capacity, is even further away from areas of projected enrollment growth. So for that reason, and the fact that it's got a smaller neighborhood setting and is within the range of where the task force thought school size should be, led the task force to say expanding Brooklyn would not be necessarily a wise decision. So it's not included in any of the paths that are presented. Turning to Rome Corners, as you saw, we have a significant issue emerging or brewing at Rome Corners with regard to the capacity. So that school was certainly looked at closely for expansion capability. In the end, though, the task force did not include expansion of Rome Corners in any of the final 4 paths that are in the report. The reasons are several. The site area is relatively small. The school is designed in kind of a unique pod system that makes expansion a little bit more challenging from a design perspective than some other potential designs. I've been told, but I haven't seen it at drop-off or pickup time, that traffic congestion is significant at Rome Corners. Expanding it would make it only worse. If expanding Rome Corners would run contrary to some of the goals that the task force developed, including keeping school sizes moderate, particularly for younger kids, and minimizing the length of time that kids would have to stay, younger kids especially, in buses to get to school. I think the task force spent the most time on what to do about Oregon Middle School. And so therefore some of the options have had, and the final paths do, expanding Oregon Middle School as one of the components, and some of them do not. And that was really because expanding the middle school certainly ran in favor or consistent with some of the goals that the task force had, and then contrary to some of the other goals, including moderate school sizes. So the paths that you see with an expansion of the middle school has the middle school growing to a capacity of around 900 kids or so, without a clear way out or a clear way to a second middle school in that post-2030 period. And what we found in looking at this is that if you're going to look at a path that has does not expand Oregon Middle School, we think it makes the most sense to look at a middle school concept that has more than just 2 grades within it. Otherwise, you would be looking at a middle school, two middle school situation with either one middle school that had a lot more kids and another with fewer kids, or somehow depopulating Oregon Middle School below its capacity to balance those out for many, many years. High school was not a focus of the project, especially given the work that had been recently completed. The task force, all the paths suggest the infill of the anticipated expansion space within the high school to accommodate enrollment growth through 2030. So armed with those projections, the goals and parameters, and the evaluation of existing facilities, the task force then dug into developing different options and facility paths.
Yep. At this point, any board member have any question about the enrollment projections, the capacity projections, or the goals that have been presented? You know, we've seen some of this before on a couple occasions. Okay. Yep, Tim.
You might want to talk just a little bit about those projections and what could happen economically, and how those figured into some of the options that you arrived at.
You mean broader economic and real estate market shifts? Mm-hmm. Sure. We did not assume either the continuation of the market over the last 2 or 3 years, which has been very hot, nor did we assume a crash like we had after the year 2030 in our projections. However, we do have a more significant Fitchburg presence in your growth than obviously you have in any previous period of time. And that's based on specific policy direction that the city of Fitchburg has to direct growth to the Highway 14 M rail corridor. So they're intentionally shifting demand to your district because of those factors, not necessarily because they prefer the Oregon district to the Verona district or the other, but based on transportation and other factors. So that certainly played into the projection. So if the district, or if our nation experienced a housing crash like we did between 2007 and 2011 or so, I think the projections would still happen, but we would be looking at a 2034 horizon instead of a 2030 horizon. Conversely, if growth was faster than we anticipated, that 2030 date could happen sooner. The facility paths all have different decision points, and I think I would anticipate that before you would make decision point number 2 or 3 happen, that you would kind of take a step back, figure out where things really are in the housing market in the year 2023 or 2026 or where we happen to be before making those decisions.
A question along those lines is, how susceptible is the growth projections in Fitchburg to something short of a crash? It's just like if we have a pullback of the economy, my inclination or belief would be that that area is going to grow notwithstanding the national economy or the state economy, that there's just going to be growth there, period. But tell me if I'm off base on that.
Well, there's a couple of factors going on. First off, you've seen it throughout the region, and it's not just a regional issue, it's a national issue. The growth in multiple family housing over the last 5-7 years has been phenomenal. There have been significant amounts of development. At the same time, studies, including those done by the Regional Planning Commission and the City of Madison here, see vacancy rates flat and still really low. So the demand for multiple family has been strong. But there are folks, people that are building multiple family that may have built 200-unit projects in 3 buildings all at once 3 years ago that are saying, well, I'm going to build the first 75, get that all done, and then I'll build the next 75 and then the next 75. So there's a tentativeness with the multiple family market. That's certainly there. The second thing that could certainly influence growth in Fitchburg. To what degree is interesting, because most of the time, and we certainly factored these in, those new multiple family projects that you see cropping up along Lacey Road are generating about 1 school kid in your district for every 10 or 20 units. So they're not generating a lot per unit, but some of them have 150 units on 3 acres of land. So you could get a significant amount per acre from each of those projects. The other thing I'll point out, and it gets to your broader point, is that if you look at a map of the Dane County area and you look at access to the Beltline, to downtown, to the other employment growth centers, including those in Fitchburg that are right there, that's really ground zero for growth and development. And so regionally, the transportation is excellent. Utilities are there on the west side. They will be there on the east side as soon as the ground thaws in the spring. So a lot of the ingredients for growth and development are there, and I expect there will be ups and downs there given the vagaries of the market, but I think it will be a strong growth area for the next 10 to 20 years. And then the city has other neighborhoods that are planned to develop after the ones you see popping up now.
In the district?
In the district, yeah.
Else have any questions about this initial phase of the report? Okay.
So that was a long wind-up to talking about the alternative facility paths that the task force developed and vetted, and went really back and forth with the Vision Steering Committee on over the past couple of months. So what are the alternative facility paths? They're based on the evaluation and winnowing of multiple options that the task force considered. A path is a general direction, includes a number of different steps. Each path was numbered. The numbers have no significance beyond trying to keep things relatively organized. Path 1 has 2 variations. Both of the Path 1 variations retain the current grade grouping structure of the district. And both of those paths end up in the same place around the year 2030 in terms of the schools that you have in the district. Just take a little bit different route to get there. Paths 2 and 3 and now 4 include a shift of grade groupings, like the district, like many have done in the past to accommodate different changes. Path 2 would shift to a system that would have a K through 3 in a lower elementary or elementary grade group, a 4 through 6 in the second, and then retaining 7 and 8 and 9, 12 grade groups, excuse me. Path 5, or I'm sorry, Path 3, there is not a Path 5. Path 3 would shift to a K5, 6, 8, 9, 12 grade group. And then Path 4, I'll talk a little bit more, as a combination or really a transition from Path 1B to Path 3 over time. This is how the paths are presented in the report. They're actually presented in a number of different ways. I don't expect anyone to be able to read this on screen, but each path describes a little bit about what it does with the grade groupings. It describes early steps, or what we'd expect would happen first over the next couple to few years. Below that, it describes what we anticipate the school configuration would be under that path by around the year 2030. Again, that could be 2028, it could be 2034, depending on how fast the district actually grows. So each of those little boxes represents a different school. Hopefully the abbreviations make some sense. The columns go from serving the littler kids to the bigger kids from left to right. The colors have significance as well. If the box is gray, it means the school would stay relatively the same as it is today. If the box is pink, that's a new school in that particular path. And if the box is green, that means there's some more significant expansion or remodeling of that school in that particular path. And then the right-hand column, which I will not go into any more detail here tonight, is that kind of a blow-by-blow how you get to the end of that path. And in particular, that chart is really the only place in the report that shows what happens potentially after the year 2030, what you're left with if you follow that path, how flexible it is. So I'm going to walk through each of the paths now, at least give you an overview of what they say. And again, I know this is a review for many of you. The Path 1A, again, Path 1s are retaining the current grade group structure. Each of the paths have, as an early step, acquiring land for a new school building, because all the paths have at least one, and most of the time 2 new schools as part of their progression between now and 2030. Path 1A has construction of 2 new schools pretty early on. The construction of a K4 school to deal with the elementary enrollment growth we saw, or I presented earlier, and the construction of a new intermediate school within that path. On the right-hand side, you see those schools in the year 2030. That path also includes the expansion of the middle school. That's why it's in green, and the infill of the high school. Path 1B, you look at the right-hand side, the 2030 school configuration is exactly the same as I just presented for Path 1A. So the difference is really what you do in the first steps of 1B. In addition to acquiring land, and instead of 2 schools being built initially, 1 new school would be built in Path 1B. That would be a K through 6 school. So for a period of time, you would have 3 elementary schools, the 3 current ones. That would be K through 4, and you'd have 1 hybrid elementary intermediate school. That would be a K through 6 school, operating in parallel with Rome Corners as well as a 5 through 6 school. And then as the district continued to grow, Path 1B converts that K through 6 school to a K4 school. So you would end up again in the year 2030 with 4 K through 4 schools. And how do you do that? That path has construction of a new 5-6 school a little bit later on in the progression. Again, 1B also has the expansion of the middle school. Path 2 is our first grade configuration change path. In addition to in the land acquisition in the early phase, we have construction of a new grade 4 through 6 school. So the elementary schools, I should say, well, let me just continue. and it converts Rome Corners to also serve grades 4 through 8. So 4 through 6. What happens with the existing elementary schools to deal with the capacity issues we see is that they have to serve fewer grades. So they serve grades K through 3, and that pushes off the construction of a new K through 3 school to a little bit later on. So the 2030 school configuration has that new 4 through 6 school coming earlier, and then later on a new K through 3 elementary school. Path 2 still has the expansion of the middle school and the infill of the high school. I'm sorry, that was Path 2. Path 3 is shifting, another grade configuration shift, but a different one than is presented in Path 2. In Path 3, we're shifting to a K through 5, 6 through 8, 9 through 12 grade configuration. Path 3 has, in the short term, the most significant changes in terms of what your different schools are doing of all of the different paths. So in Path 3, all of the elementary schools, plus Rome Corners, would have some grade configuration shifts to serve K through 5. So for the elementary schools, it would be adding another grade. For Rome Corners, it would be changing that from a 5-6 school to a K-5 school, which I understand it was designed to be able to accommodate. The other significant difference or change in Path 3 is that the middle school would serve grades 6 through 8. How does that possibly happen if it's already going to be over capacity? Well, a second grade 6 through 8 school would be built, and that would be built in the short term to accommodate that enrollment growth. So we address the K through 6 enrollment growth versus capacity. We see it just a little bit different way than we do in the other options. What we have with that option in the year 2030 is we have 5 K through 5 schools. We'll eventually need to add a 5th one sometime between now and 2030, but not as an early step because Rome Corners kind of fills the void initially in that elementary level. And then you see the 2 middle schools. Notably, the Oregon Middle School, the current middle school does not have an expansion within Path 3 because that is the capacity is taken by that new 6 through 8 school. Path 4 was developed relatively late in the game. What Path 4 is a hybrid or a transition between Path 1B early and Path 3 later. So the early steps, like the others, include the acquisition of land. The early step in Path 4 is the same as 1B. In fact, all of them are building a new grade K through 6 elementary school. That K through 6 school in Path 4 would later convert to a K through 5 school, because that would happen at the same time a new grade 6 through 8 school. That's when the leap would happen between the current grade configuration and the grade configuration that we see in Path 3 and ultimately in Path 4. The leap between a K4, 5, 6, 7, 8 grouping that you currently have and a K5, 6, 8 grouping in that particular path. So it's challenging to explain. You'll see one of the cons of Path 4 is that it is a little bit more difficult to explain, but it does provide some additional flexibility beyond both beyond 2030 and within the between now and 2030 time frame.
Jeff, I think you've got a question for Mark.
It's probably really a question for administrators. When I was going to school, I attended a K-8 and then a 4-year high school, so I had to transition schools once. And when my son started going to school in Oregon here, I was somewhat surprised by the 3 transitions. So I have 2 questions. One, how big of a deal is the school transition for the student? Is it just first couple weeks of the school year getting used to the new setting, or are there longer lasting ramifications of a school change? That's my first question. The second one is, how much emphasis should we place on trying to reduce the number of transitions in the district?
We actually talked about that extensively, and talked about the thing with the transition that was most cumbersome for us to deal with. It gets really loud. Okay. Was the idea that kids are in and out of a 2-year school so quickly that both as a parent, and Leslie referenced when she was the principal at Rome Corners, that you just start to get to know those kids and you send them out. As you know, historically, the plan was always to flip, many years ago, Rome Corners back into an elementary to decrease the transition, and it just was kind of a holding building for a while. And then that whole Swan Creek thing did not come to fruition with our district. So it was never the intent to have that many transitions. In my experience, having worked at 3 of the buildings in the district, I feel pretty strongly that that extra transition is a lot for kids, especially going into Rome Corners. You're there for 2 years, and then you switch out again to another building. And I think Leslie would echo it maybe from a different angle as well.
We decided as a group that it was important the number of transitions didn't increase. So we wanted to, it would be great to decrease, but we knew that we would, had the floor and we wouldn't increase the number of transitions. And we talked about the fact that it is very difficult to get to know students in 2 years, and for parents to get to know the feel of the school in that short of an amount of time. But for some kids, the transition is kind of fun. And for other kids, it's something that makes them anxious. So I think even when they're split like that, I think we have to think a little bit about what to do for the kids that don't feel very comfortable in making that many transitions.
And Jeff, one of the things that Brian and I have talked about at the beginning stages of receiving this is creating a feedback loop for that very question, is to get some broader input in terms of where folks are at in terms of grade configuration and transition times or transition points. Because that is I have that as a fundamental question as well. As we look at the options, is what is our grade configuration? What are the number of transition we have as an initial decision point? One of a couple. So, yep, Barb.
I would like any of the administrators who've taught at middle school or task force members who've taught at a middle school to talk a little bit about the implications of having one large middle school.
Most of my educational professional career was in middle school, and I would say that a very large middle school is a really bad idea. It's a tough time to be a kid, and a very large setting is a tough place to feel like you belong. And so the larger a school gets, the more anonymous you become. So I think that a very large middle school would never be something that I would recommend. I've taught it at middle schools that range in size from 500 to almost 800 students, and I would say someplace between 500 and 600 is the most comfortable for kids, but over 800 is really not a good idea.
And just for those folks who are watching, you're Carlene Betchen.
Oh, I'm Carlene Betchen, and I was a middle school educator for 28 plus years.
Yep, and in the Madison district, right?
In the Madison district,
yeah. And,
yes.
And Carlene was on the task force.
Yes,
and
I'm a task
in the town
force
of Oregon,
member.
Right? Yeah.
And my kids went to Oregon.
Thanks, Carlene.
We also discussed the role of design, and that if the community wanted students to come together earlier than high school, that design could be one way to make a school feel smaller, even if it had more students. But when we spoke to a group of middle school educators last week, a comment was made that resonated with me, and that was, when a school's that big, there are so many more students that you see in the hallways that you never get to know. And you wonder how that feels for students to see all kinds of adults that they don't get to know over the course of time because the school's just so much bigger.
Shannon, did you want to say a few words?
My sentiments as the middle school principal are very similar to what has already been shared when Brian and Leslie spoke with our leadership team last week. I think middle school in particular is so relationship based because students are really trying to figure out who they are and going through puberty and all that good stuff. And so the emotional support and the connections that they need to make, I think, are critical. And that gets really hard when you have hundreds of kids and families, and just the connections with staff. Middle level educators are all about relationships. I mean, they are at every level, but it just, I think, becomes more paramount at that level. So the thought of trying to get to have relationships with 900 to 1,000 kids in a 2-year building would be really hard, I think, for families, kids, and staff.
Board members, just to reaffirm, and I know I provide a lot of updates to you, so I'm dusting your memory off for a second. Leslie and I have been visiting. So far we've made it to 4 of the school leadership teams in the district on a K-8 basis. We have a meeting scheduled with all the leadership teams to discuss the very question about transitions and about grade configurations and the report in its entirety. We also plan to go back and visit with all school faculties at a faculty meeting, ideally before spring break, but it may take us a week or 2 into April. And I had a conversation with Steve about we need to really hear from our school staff in terms of where they're at in relation to the grade changes, the configuration changes, and transitions. I will say so far, no one has passed out at any of our meetings when we've talked about 2,000 students, and we must have done an okay job marketing that concept because everyone realizes. I just looked at the green, red, yellow bracket tonight, and in 3 years we'll have 688 additional students. 688. Now Mark might be off by a little bit. It may be 588. It could be maybe over 688 students. So we really have some pressure associated with this decision because you all know we don't have enough facility space right now for an additional 688 students. So that loop's going to continue. We've had some very preliminary discussions, and just today we set a communication meeting with our 3 partners. So our district staff, and Erica is going to be leading that up for us. We're going to be meeting with Bray Architects, Findorf Contractors, as well as the Donovan Group the last day in February to start our conversations about how we message all of this information to the community.
Anybody else have any questions as long as we're on a roll? Dan?
I was curious about the task force's priority or aim to try to keep or to try to get all the students together as soon as possible. Can you talk about that and why the task force thought that was important? Because it's not intuitive to me.
I can start, but I encourage any of the task force members to contribute to this discussion. We thought about the fact that in our community right now, students are brought together very early. 3 different elementary schools come together in grade 5, and those kids are with each other all the way through their high school experience. And for many people, that's considered part of a small community experience. And so to not be able to bring students together until high school, actually, I think it's just a sign of the fact that we're a growing community. But it was one of those things that we thought may be difficult for some people to surrender. because a lot of people, I'm sure, are very happy to be in a small community where the kids can come together in grade 5. However, that does not seem to be our future. And for me, I find that kind of exciting because now we get to do great things for even more kids. But for some people, the small community feel of coming together at 5th grade might be something that they're sad to see go. Anyone else?
The emphasis wasn't, in my opinion, on when kids should all come together at what grade level it would be, because obviously we're dealing with space crunches. But what the district does a really good job of, that was made very clear, is that when they do all come together as one grade level, they come together in a pod setting, which happens at Rome Corners as well as the middle school. So even though there's a whole grade level of students that come together at the 5th grade, there's 4 different pods so that those kids aren't literally overwhelmed like they would at a 900 student middle school. Even though that 900 number sounds huge to a lot of people, there's still a smaller pod, so it's not such a walking through the halls with everybody all of the time. So I don't think it was a huge emphasis to say they have to come together at this certain grade point, because you're limited as to what kind of facilities you have and what's the best way to do that. But at the 5th grade level, I believe it's about 70 kids per pod. Is that right? And then as they get older into a larger setting, then that becomes a little bit more. So they transition into that pod setting, gets a little bit bigger each year until that 9th grade level, where it seems like it's even bigger. But
well, and there has been some talk about at 9th grade doing something different at 9th grade, where there's an academy, 9th grade academy, where you group them differently than what we do now, instead of dispersing them out amongst everyone. So I mean, there's some options available if the option that's chosen here in terms of grade configuration is to bring them together for the first time as freshmen. So thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
So this just is regarding the school capacities. How does RCI compare with the grade schools, and how do the different grade schools compare? Are they about the same size? Are we going to have different sized grade schools if we bring RCI into this, the grade school line?
I don't know. I think I could begin to speak about this, but Matt, is there anything you would like to say regarding capacity? I mean, right now there's a span of about, I think a difference of about 75 students between Netherwood and Prairie View, and Netherwood has significantly more square footage than Prairie View, so the fact that there's a bit of a difference there makes sense. What we're hoping to do is to create elementary schools that all have a similar range. They certainly wouldn't be identical, but within 100 students or so would be where we would try to be. So we don't want one very big and one very small. We'd like to be consistent, because another one of the goals and values was providing a consistent experience no matter which school you're at.
Dan, I would say in general, all of the elementary schools will be similar in size. Right now, we're solving in all of these solutions for kind of spreading students equally across buildings and trying to utilize them as best as possible. The reality will be how we boundary, how we create attendance areas. That will probably create a little bit more. We estimate that Rome Corners could house approximately 600 elementary school students. I think that might be a little high, and we're going to have to talk about how the curriculum, if we go K-5, affects the ability for that building to house that many students. So there's 2 components, what grade level, and I think we're mainly talking K-5 in that scenario, where we would use Rome Corners as an elementary school. But overall, all of the elementary schools, I believe, are in the 500 to 650 range-ish. Including existing buildings and any new proposals for elementary schools.
Anybody else? Mark, I think then, did you finish walking through the presentation?
I got through through the paths. The rest of the presentation is really comparing the paths to one another.
Good point to do that now, yeah.
Okay.
We've sort of embarked on that path already.
Right. Yeah. So the The task force and its staff took this evaluation from a number of different angles. We compared the paths against one another and some of the key quantitative statistics. We haven't talked about dollars yet. This chart is the first foray into talking about the initial general estimates for how much each path would cost. The rows represent the different paths in this chart. The final two columns are the cost figures. The costs are presented in terms of ranges and in terms of short-term costs before approximately the year 2023 and longer-term costs. And you can see they're all within the, I would say, $10 million of one another in terms of total costs. So the cost is not a significant factor, in my opinion, of comparing the options versus one another. They do differ in terms of when the costs come online, and you can see that in this graph pretty noteworthy. The other thing we've talked already about is that's presented here is when kids come together and how many transitions. So that is presented here on this particular graph as well. We selected 8 of the goals and parameters that came up over and over again and charted each of these paths as to whether they perform the best or the worst against each of those goals or somewhere in between. So this particular graph shows if you have a particular issue, say it's costs or providing schools close to where students are, where each path rates on that particular scale or goal. And I will not attempt to go through these here tonight, but it's another way to look at these paths. And the final way the report presents the paths is what are the kind of nutshell, what are the key advantages or pros of each path and what are the cons of each path. And we've talked a lot about those here already. Some of the paths do well against many goals. Some of the paths do well against particular goals and not so well against others. So it all depends on what ultimately is most important to the district. Some of the paths in terms of cons, as we talked about, 1A, 1B, and 2, they have the Big Oregon Middle School within them, which the task force viewed as their disadvantages or weaknesses. And some of the other options that kind of move away from that have construction of a new middle school, and new middle school construction is more expensive than new elementary school construction, for instance. So costs tend to go up if you go away from that expanded middle school. That does conclude the presentation. So it was a lot of information to absorb. There'll be time to absorb it. This came together over the last couple of days. We'll certainly share the presentation with the board and the community as well over the next couple of days.
Thank you, Mark, for presenting that. We thought it was important for you and the task force to come tonight to be at a regular board meeting to present this. I know we've seen this in stages over the last month or so at Vision Steering Committee, and board members have been there, but it's important for this to be accessible to the community on cable, and we're also going to post this on our website and have the materials there so that we can begin that educational process. But begins our process as a board having got this report. I think the first thing we need to do is receive the report on the recommendation of Vision Steering Committee to have that motion to receive the report from the task force, and then to ask any follow-up questions, informational questions of the task force members and their consultants, and then start talking about a path forward, which Brian and I have talked about. So I think first thing is we've got the report. Are there any questions that we have about anything that was presented, as opposed to thoughts or initial ideas? Okay. Dan?
I just wanted to say that as being there in the committee and looking at this at the first time, this report, and now looking at it the second time, it's a little bit changed because we got the path forward, which was kind of discussed during the committee. But it's a lot to take in. And it's exciting, and it's somewhat overwhelming. And I wanted to just let people know that we know that you considered more than these 5 options. So I think somebody had said you'd considered something like 17 different options, and threw out most of them because they just didn't make either financial sense or other. They didn't meet the criteria in other different ways. Can you say anything about your confidence that what we're looking at here as options really, there wasn't anything else that people are probably going to want to see?
I can attest. In fact, I've got a gold chart in front of me. In case this question came up, we had options A through L on this particular chart. We considered a grade K through 8 building. We considered grade configurations K through 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 12, which we haven't discussed here today, but that was on the table. And eventually, though both of those two were rejected because of some discomfort with the grade groups and that are being put together in those particular options. Have we considered every single imaginable option? Certainly not. But I think that the task force turned over every stone. We had a couple of, I'd say 3 or 4 sessions in which we considered, added, subtracted different options. And there were some that were suggested late in the game. Those are included in the report as variations of these options. You can look at those in the detailed report. I feel confident that a very wide range of options were carefully considered, and the ones that bubble to the top are the ones that are the 4 plus that you see in the final report. But I'd certainly defer to the group.
Any member of the task force want to say anything to the board? I know Mark's done a great job of summarizing stuff, but if you guys want to say anything, looks like you're all pretty comfortable with what's been reported out. Yeah.
In the 50 slides, I got to most of it.
Yeah. As has been the case. Jeff, I think the board's ready at this point from
Steve.
Oh, hi, Carlene.
Hi. I just think that the process that was undertaken here was guided very well by Mark. Looking at capacity, thinking about the values and goals and parameters that we, from a very broad range of experience, identified as the things that were important to keep in considering various plans, was a great way to start, because we weren't just looking at lots of stuff without having thought about what makes a good school district and the things that we want to make sure that we keep and promote about this school district. So when we had a variety of plans and we could go back to those things to look at them and say, this is what we said before we started, to weigh those against what we'd learned and all of the plans that were out there, was a fabulous process, and there was lots of opportunity for input and for questions all along the way. So I think, yeah, we've turned over every rock we could kick, and I think that Mark has done a really fine job of leading through that process and not pointing us in one direction or another, but really letting us come to some conclusions. So I hats off to the task force and to Mark for the whole shebang.
Jim,
I want to echo the sentiments. Not just Mark was a great asset, but Courtney and Leslie also did an excellent job guiding us as a group, staying on task. And to kind of answer your question, Dan, to start with, I think it was 12 initial, but to pare that down to these 3 or 4 that we have left, just like Carlene said, we went back to to the issues that were the most important, I guess, that we had established very early on. To they didn't just bubble up from the top. It wasn't easy to eliminate certain options, but we went back to our original guidelines as to what was really important, just like Carlene said, and that's why these ones are left. So we as a task force, I think, feel very comfortable that these are going to serve the district as best as any of the options we had there. So.
And now you can see what a great group we had to work with. Okay,
Yeah,
so we really had a great group that were willing to put in the time and effort to get to this portion of the process and hand it over to the board as the final decision makers.
Thank you. Jeff, I think it's time now that we consider whether to receive the report coming from Vision Steering Committee.
Well, this motion is not coming from Vision Steering Committee, so it will require a second. Yeah. But I move that the board accept the report from the Student Growth and Population Task Force.
I need a second. Dan seconds that motion. Is there any discussion to receive the report that we've had this evening from the Growth Task Force? I've got just a couple comments about that. When we, about a year and a half ago, anticipated that we were going to be looking at significant growth, we considered doing a task force to pull together facts, and I think that it was beyond my expectation that we would get a report that's this detailed and comprehensive and thorough and teeing it up essentially for us in terms of decision points. This is just an amazing product that we have. The community should understand that underlying this report is a lot of work. I've showed the growth projections that we've received from Mark and the work that he's put into that, the capacity projections that Bray and Matt Wolford have put together to show us where we're at and how those come together, and then just the number of options that we've received is terrific. We're in a position as a board now, and one that has in the past strived to be a data decision or data-driven board, now have data for us to make some informed decisions and to go out and get feedback on with facts as opposed to hypothesis and anecdote. So this is terrific. And so tonight here we've got Julie Isley, Carlene Betcham, and Jim Hagstrom, and Carrie. And then we also want to thank Phil Van Camp and Bob Eveland and Tracy Leiter, who engaged their time. Mark, terrific work with this. We're really pleased with what we've got and the time you put in it. Matt, we've worked together a long time, and we're glad that you decided to stay with us and lend us your expertise.
Me too.
In terms of the building paths forwards. So thanks very much. And then Leslie and Courtney, thank you for your leadership and driving the task force and getting a product that we have here tonight. We appreciate it very much. We've got some hard work to do ahead of us, but it's made a lot easier because of what we have submitted to us. And so with that, Janie, would you call the roll and the motion on the tables to receive the report from the task force?
Mr. Raymond?
Yes.
Mr. Kraus?
Yes.
Mr. LeBrun?
Yes.
Ms. Feeney? Yes. Ms. Odorico?
Yes.
Ms. Flanagan?
Yes.
Mr. Zock?
Yes, so the report is received unanimously by the board, and I think with that task force, your work is concluded unless we reconvene you or ask you to do something more on it, and we will move forward as a board to work on how we're going to proceed, but it comes with great thanks on behalf of the Oregon School District and the board. So, good work, you guys. So that puts us as a board into a path forward with respect to the report. And Brian, if you could kind of walk through some of your thoughts in terms of where we go, and then the board could discuss that.
I'll give you three big sort of ticket items. I think big ticket item number one is for the board to schedule a few work sessions to process through all of this information. I know you've heard before about the enrollment projections. You've heard about the existing capacities, the various options. Now we have a fifth pathway, and then what are our next steps as a district to address the growth? So that's option, or that's big ticket item one. Big ticket item number two is the community engagement process. We have a meeting, I mentioned it earlier, with Bray, Donovan, and Findorf on February 28th, so we're going to get that process off and rolling. But we also need to reach out to our community with either some meetings, some presentations, sharing information that we can do online as well. We do have a couple of opportunities, and the Oregon Observer reached out to me. They have an open spot on February 22nd for a guest column. So we could put together a guest column, have that as another community engagement process. We can also use our district-wide email and reach out with some background information, not what the plan might be, but again, background information to share with the community. You know, this past week we had our youth sports task force together twice, and I used a little public service announcement to do a pre-assessment to see how many of our parents and community members were familiar with the fact that we will be growing by 2,000 students by the year 2030. And I think the unofficial result was about 99% of our community members, and we had close to 90 on 2 evenings, were familiar with that concept. So we have some messages out there, but we need to continue with that. And then the third big ticket item is the statutory timelines associated with a future referendum. One of the things we've learned over time is often it's best to go when the majority of voters have an opportunity to vote on a referendum. That has been at gubernatorial or presidential elections. We have one of those coming up this November. You know that if we go at a gubernatorial or presidential election, there will likely be 12,000 votes in the community, plus minus. If we were to go in an April election, there's plus minus 5,000 votes. So that's something that the board will have to weigh through over the upcoming months. So with those three sort of frameworks, board work sessions, community engagement, and our statutory requirements, Steve and I have had a conversation about putting together a more comprehensive timeline to share with you, but we didn't want to get too far ahead because tonight's purpose is really to receive the report publicly, to ask questions, and for all of us to continue to formulate and process through what really is remarkable information for a community. There isn't a community in the state that wouldn't trade for the economic and the growth that we have in our district. While it brings a few challenges, the opportunity it brings for our current students and for our future students is just absolutely incredible. So it's fun to be part of that process, and I know that I've had an opportunity to visit with every task force member, and the work that they did, as Steve mentioned, was just flat out terrific. It really positions our board and our community to move forward during this super exciting time and to put together a plan and a path that will impact public education in the Oregon School District for years ahead. So our plan is to get back to all of you board members with a bit of a timeline, and I didn't put it on our next agenda, but we could have a work session at our next 2 board meetings. We don't have a super extensive list of agenda items for our next 2 meetings, and that's all before we get into staffing. There now I have Gina's attention in the month of April, so it might really be a good use of our collective time to have a couple of work sessions coming up. I'll stop and see if you have any questions or comments.
I'm thinking, Brian, that And let's, board members, what do you think about doing something on the 26th, of dedicating at least an hour for a work session amongst us? I think one of the things that we have to talk about is what kind of timeline we're on. You're meeting Erica's group with the publicity's meeting, what, on the 28th?
On the 28th.
So that would give us an opportunity to provide some feedback to you on kind of what we're thinking in terms of feedback loop, in terms of information that the board would deem valuable in terms of its decision making. So that works with that, kind of timeline with numbers, both not only with respect to the statutory referendum guidelines, but in terms of when we're going to need space and what timeline do we need in terms of passing a referendum, planning the design, getting that building on board to meet the needs for the population growth. So we're going to need that on the 26th, that timeline, so that we can begin making some decisions as to our process, number one, and then our decision making, number two. So that will need provide you with some feedback, and then also to start getting some preliminary thoughts from the board with respect to the options before you. I think we'll need to know kind of which ones the board really is interested in looking at and getting feedback on, and which ones are we not interested in, if we're able to do that. So I see those three things at the meeting, but I'll throw it open to the board for your thoughts about the sessions that we're going to hold in terms of working on the report we got. Anybody? Or does that sound like a good plan? Okay, so we will plan on having a work session on the 26th, and that would include looking at timelines, looking at a feedback plan, and giving some information to you and Erica, so you know kind of what the board's interest is in that regard, so you can make some decisions, and then start getting some ideas from the board about the options that are beforehand. Start sifting and winnowing a little bit, providing feedback. So that'll be on the 26th, and then we'll make a decision on the 26th where to go from there. Okay?
That sounds perfect.
Okay, that's good. Does anybody from the board need any further information before the 26th to request from Brian? Anything? Okay, seeing none. One thing that down the line that I would like to see is the impact on taxpayers of these plans, and it's I know there are a lot of variables when you start looking at this, but just a rough guess of what this means. I mean, there's a broad elevator speech that a lot of this, when we're talking about additional, we're doing a referendum to add long-term debt, that we're going to be adding equalized assessed value in the district that will reduce the cost to current taxpayers to do that. That is, new growth will pay for new growth. But if we can kind of quantify that for us in a real rough way.
Andy and Michelle Weiberg, you'll recall Michelle is from PMA. They've done some preliminary looks already, and I think in a couple of weeks they could bring back some big picture, real broad stroke information for you to consider.
That would be good. Good. So then I think we've got a plan set forward. Good. Anybody have anything else they want to add on this topic? Else we'll move on our agenda. Good. Thanks, Erwin. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Matt, for being here. Task force members, thanks for coming to our meeting and presenting for us in all your work. And now we move on. Discussion items. F, committee reports. Policy, we got a report tonight. Anything new to add? Nope. Vision Steering Committee, Jeff?
Vision Steering Committee will be meeting next Wednesday, the 21st, and we'll be discussing transportation.
Great.
Same time, same place, 7:30 a.m.
Great. Takes us to information items
for
G.
us and all your work. And now we move on.
Okay, that was really weird. Or it sounded like a Beatles album. Yeah. Go to information items, then state budget 2017, 2019, and
sure, I'll take
Brian.
Yeah, I'll take this one. This is just 3 real quick updates. I know everyone is familiar with the governor's budget from this last year, the 17-19 budget. We are still planning on that approximately $200 per pupil amount in the 18-19 budget for our school district. There's also some work being done at the state on low spending districts being able to collect additional property tax. We are not one of those low spending districts, but today the Joint Finance Committee approved on a vote of 16-0. It has been a long time since they have approved anything in the Joint Finance Committee on a unanimous basis to add $6.5 million and to allow low spending districts to collect additional property taxes. I think that's a crucial, important provision for our neighboring districts across the state that are not seeing growth. Then the last item, just to give you a quick update on, the Blue Ribbon Commission on School Funding, which has held 3 different meetings so far. We don't have a lot of details in terms of what their plan is. I doubt there will be significant changes because we're in the middle of a state budget. Hopefully this will all take effect if we're able to make some modifications for the 1921 state budget. But Luther Olson, who has been a longtime friend of public education from the central part of the state, the Oshkosh area, he is one of the co-chairs of the committee, and he was really instrumental in us getting the $200 for the last 2 school years in the state budget. So I want to be cautiously optimistic that perhaps something great will come from the Blue Ribbon Commission on School Funding. I'm happy to answer any questions or just to keep right on moving to the superintendent's report.
Keep on moving.
Keep on moving. Okay, January 25th, we closed out the current OHS Art Gallery showing, and we are getting ready for the next showing, which I believe will be a photography exhibit. Oh, it's up. Oh, terrific.
We can open it up tonight if people want to watch.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Next item. We'll send around 2 awards that the district received at the annual chamber dinner. The one going to the right is the Building Renovation Award for our new construction, and the one to the left is the President's Award that I ended up getting on behalf of the Oregon School District. So that was an exciting and fun time, and fun to be recognized by our peers in the community. On February 1st, Steve and I met with the OEA co-presidents in our monthly meeting, and we're a couple of weeks away from another one of those monthly meetings. Most of our focus has been on the Growth Task Force work, and we continue to have a nice, strong, open communication line with our association. On February 2nd, we sent report cards out to all elementary parents. So far, I think they have been well received. I don't know if that means everyone ended up with the grade that they were looking for, but I haven't received a telephone call, so whoa, that is pretty amazing. February 7th and 11th, I'm not going to steal too much of Krista's thunder, although the Youth Sports Task Force hosted a summit for approximately 90 community members, and one of the worries when you do it on 2 nights is how many people will show up the second night, and we had the same amount show up on the second night. So, and what a thank you we owe our community members to donate and volunteer 6 hours of their time for an important project. So you will hear more of that perhaps tonight from Krista. We were able to hold the middle school madrigal dinner on Friday, February 9th, which is a little different than our normal rule. Our normal rule is if we cancel school because of a snow day, we cancel the night activities. I will say that Shannon's email and my email received a lot of encouragement to hold the magical dinner on Friday night. And there was also, if we didn't hold the dinner, we wouldn't have the opportunity to redo it. We felt we were super safe because the roads were cleared by noon. So that's a little different than our normal practice, but I knew everyone would understand. Two last items. We have Bus Driver Appreciation Week this week, so nuts. I forgot to mention it before Jim left, but we have 26 routes in the district, so we're recognizing all of our bus contractors and our bus drivers. And then lastly, I found a picture that summarizes what our focus needs to be like. If you read the Oregon Observer this last week, Ray Kersherik, and Ray happens to be Ginny's daughter. Ginny is one of our teachers. She's one of our math coaches. The look on this young lady's face at the Beating the Winter Blues activity at Brooklyn Elementary School just describes the word focus in a way that I haven't seen it for a while. So my goal is to have that level of focus between now and when we make a final decision relative to the construction project. So I will hand this around, and if you've seen this picture, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it is one of the cutest pictures of intense focus that I've seen for a long time. So that concludes my report, unless you have a question for me.
Thank you, Brian. You have at your place an agenda for February 26th that includes, we're going to have a special meeting at 6:30, Janie, are we going to call that?
Yeah, it's special.
Okay, the special meeting will be at 6:30, and that's to get district electors' approval for the purchase and sale of residential lots for the home construction. It's a statutory requirement that we hold a special meeting, so we'll have that at 6:30, and then convene our regular scheduled meeting, and including on the agenda, assuming we get elector approval to purchase and sale, the board would also need to authorize those as well. So those are on the agenda. 5-year budget plan, Andy, kind of.
We're going to try to take Mr. Roffer's information and extrapolate that.
Okay, so we'll work on that night, and then we're also going to do a work session of the board as we discussed earlier. So we'll see how it goes. I was thinking about doing a closed session on then to finalize Brian's eval. I owe you guys kind of a written draft so that we can go over that. So if I get a feel for the time of that we're not going to go that late, I might put that on for a quick closed session to close that loop, okay? Else we'll bump that into the first meeting in March. Does anybody else have anything else they'd like on the agenda for the 26th? Okay, if you do, let us know. Let's do checkout now. I'll go around. Ellen, anything you want to check out on? Okay, pretty interesting on the growth, huh? Yeah. Okay. Barb, Tim, Chris, I think you have something to say, don't you?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Brian said, that we had a really good sports summit. We invited over 100 people, and we had 95 or so come for both nights. People that couldn't come were out of town, but Mike and I co-chair the task force, and we have a task force of about 15 members, so we invited the community members to come into the conversation. So we had some pre-work where we asked them to read some research articles from the Washington Post, Time Magazine about what's happening nationally with youth sports and how that resonates locally. I asked them to watch some videos, and then we brought them together the first night and had a student panel. So Mike and Brian met with about 8 students, and we asked them about their sports experience here in the Oregon School District, and that was very informative to the group. And then the first night we really asked the group to think about based on what you've read, what you've heard, what you've seen, what are the important factors in a youth sports experience, and so what we think this should be all about. And then we had them come back for the second night and asked them to prioritize some themes that came out of those factors, and then we put them to work saying, okay, now that you've prioritized those, how do we get there? And so that's where we're at right now is Mike and I will be looking with the task force at the information that we received from the Youth Sports Summit in terms of what's important to this community, what action can we take to get there, and then we'll be developing some recommendations and reports that will come back to the Vision Steering Committee, which will then eventually come back to the board. And I also want to thank Dr. Brian Bussler for being our facilitator for the summit. He did a great job.
Thank you, Courtney. Anything tonight, Jeff? Dan? A couple of things. One is I went to the opening of the task force for a while, and just like the summit, our 2020 summit, there was an energy and a buzz in the room that was pretty exciting. Everybody was excited and engaged to be there, so it's a real credit to you guys for getting that group together to provide feedback with you. Brian indicated that he sent around the President's Award from the Chamber, and he was very gracious saying it's a district award, but it was intended as a personal award for his contributions to the community as a whole. So thank you for sharing with us the award, but Brian, thank you for all you do, and it was appropriate that you got recognized by the community for all you do above and beyond just being superintendent of our schools. You're truly engaged as a member of the Oregon community. In terms of task force, Brian and I have been bopping around the idea of engaging a small 3 to 4 person task force to look at the composition of the board and timing of when people get elected and the geographic locations and the numbers given the growth in the district. The last time we did that was 20 plus years ago. I was on that. I think given what we've seen, it's going to be time to look at that again. So we'll keep you updated about that and kind of what we're thinking and get some approval for that task force. Janie, you and I got to pull that material out from the last time to look at the charge and see where that goes. But if we're expecting that amount of growth, we deleted one seat in Fitchburg 20 years ago, and it might be time to look at that depending on growth. And then what does that mean in terms of our allocation from geographical areas? So, personally, and also I'd like to move, one of the Oregon seats instead of having 2 in 1 year. If we're going to have 3, that they should really rotate every year, have 1 seat up. But that would be for the task force to decide. So, and lastly, it's just kind of a note I've been watching with interest. What's happening in Monona Grove in terms of their book issue. They had a parent challenge in the curriculum, the teaching of To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And in one sense, you could look at that as book banning. There's another argument to what's going on over there, and it ties in with our equity issues. And that is one of the issues that I've heard out of Monona Grove is that it's not necessarily the book, but it's the fact that we're telling a story of color through a white writer's eyes, and should that be the exclusive voice? And are there other books to read with that? And it was significant to me because I just got finished reading Underground Railroad by Clinton Whitehead, which won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And it's terrific, and it tells a story of, he's an African-American writer. It tells a really amazing story of the Underground Railroad, and and Beloved by Toni Morrison's in the same vein. And so we can look at that issue one way, but I think there's also another way to look at it. I've been a big advocate for reading fiction. I know the standards talk about teaching reading through the eyes of 80%, I think, is looking at, business-related reading models as opposed to fiction. But fiction tells us a lot, especially when we're broad-based. So that's just my 2 cents worth of that debate, based upon kind of what I've been reading and books that I've read. So if anybody really wants to read a good book, To Kill a Mockingbird's terrific, as is The Underground Railroad. It's authored by the name of Clinton Whitehead. Colton. Yeah, you're right. Have you read it? It's really good. It's pretty metaphorical and visionary in it, but it's good. So we'll take a 5-minute break, and then board will meet over in our side conference room to do a short closed session for us. See you in 5. We will not return to open session.
Jim, you don't need to open that gallery. I'll come during the day.
You sure?
Yeah. How long is it going to be up for?
It'll be up, I think, We're going to, when it comes down in March, it'll be, I think mid or late March it'll come down.
Okay.
And then we're going to put up some walls that are kind of tack-boardy type, so we're not punching holes in the drywall. So
I would be happy to give you a personal tour.
Of the photo in the photo gallery? Thank you. All right. I'll just drop in.
Yeah, that'd be great.
No matter what you do, you can drop in. Give me a personal guide.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.